What would you do if a single act of kindness could change your life forever? Meet Malcolm, a 14-year-old boy from a struggling neighborhood who stops to help an old war veteran fix his broken wheelchair. But what happens next is something no one could have expected. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the worn-out blinds of a small, run-down house in Atlanta, Georgia. Inside, a boy no older than 14 sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by the scattered remains of a broken bicycle chain. His hands, small but calloused from hard work, struggled to fix the rusty chain with a pair of pliers that barely held together. This was Malcolm Hayes, a boy forced to grow up too fast. His father had died in a tragic construction accident 2 years ago, leaving Malcolm and his mother, Evelyn, to fend for themselves. Evelyn worked endless shifts at a local factory, her hands raw from handling machinery. The weight of unpaid bills and late rent notices hung over their home like a dark cloud, but she never let Malcolm see her cry. At least, she thought he didn't. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. It was 5:30 a.m. He only had 30 minutes to fix the bike and start his paper route. The worn wheels were his only means of earning money to help his mom keep their tiny home. His hands worked faster as the seconds ticked by. Finally, with a satisfying click, the chain slid into place. Malcolm wiped the sweat from his brow and hurriedly threw on his backpack, filled with rolled-up newspapers. He pushed the door open, stepping into the crisp morning air of the neighborhood, where the sound of distant barking dogs and the hum of early risers greeted him. As he pedaled down the uneven streets, Malcolm's mind raced. He thought of the landlord's visit the week before, the gruff man with a greasy mustache who had left them with a final warning: pay the rent by the end of the month or face eviction. Malcolm knew his mom was trying her best, but her weary face haunted him. I have to do more, he whispered to himself. Turning a corner, Malcolm's eyes caught sight of something unusual. Halfway up the hill ahead, an older man in a tattered jacket was struggling to push a wheelchair up the incline. The chair wobbled dangerously, and the man's trembling hands barely kept it steady. Malcolm slowed his bike to a stop, watching for a moment. The man, Franklin Reed, was in his early 70s. His face, weathered by time and hardship, was etched with deep lines. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he muttered to himself. Trying to maneuver the stubborn wheelchair, Malcolm hesitated, glancing at the bundle of newspapers in his bike basket. He couldn't afford to be late again. His boss at the paper company had already warned him. But as he looked back at the struggling old man, something stirred within him, a memory of his father, who had always told him, "Son, a man's worth isn't measured by what he has, but by what he gives." Without a second thought, Malcolm hopped off his bike and jogged up the hill. "Sir, do you need some help?" Malcolm asked, his voice cutting through the quiet morning. Franklin looked up, startled. For a moment, suspicion flashed in his tired eyes, but it was quickly replaced by relief. "You sure, kid? You look like you've got your own stuff to do." Malcolm shook his head. "It's fine. Let me help." Franklin stepped aside, and Malcolm grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. He could feel its weight immediately. It was heavier than it looked, but he dug his heels in and pushed with all his might. The wheels creaked and his arms burned, but slowly they made their way up the hill. "Thank you," Franklin said between breaths. Not many would stop these days. Everyone's in a rush. Malcolm glanced at the man, noticing the faded patches on his jacket and the pin on his lapel, a small American flag. "You're a veteran?" he asked. Franklin nodded. "Vietnam. Lost a lot of good men back then." Malcolm didn't know much about the war, but he could hear the pain in Franklin's voice. He didn't pry further. They reached the top of the hill, and Franklin pointed to a modest apartment complex nearby. "That's me," Franklin said. "Right there, 2C." Malcolm pushed the chair to the front door and helped Franklin inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, with peeling wallpaper and a single worn couch in the living room. Franklin sank into the couch with a heavy sigh, and Malcolm bent down to inspect the wheelchair. "This wheel's loose," Malcolm muttered, pulling a wrench from his backpack. "Give me a minute and I'll fix it." "You don't have to do that, kid," Franklin said, but his protest was weak. He watched as Malcolm tightened the bolts on the wheel and straightened the frame. When Malcolm finally stood, his face was smeared with grease, but the wheelchair looked almost new. "There," Malcolm said, brushing his hands on his jeans. "That should hold up for a while." Franklin stared at him, a smile spreading across his face. "You've got a good heart, kid. Let me at least give you something for your trouble." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, holding it out to Malcolm. But Malcolm stepped back, shaking his head. "No, sir, I don't need money," he said firmly. "You've done so much for this country. It's my turn to give back." Franklin's hand faltered, and for a moment he was speechless. "Well," he said finally, his voice thick, "you're 1 in a million, kid. Thank you." Malcolm nodded and turned to leave, but as he reached the door, Franklin called out, "What's your name, son?" "Malcolm," he replied. "Malcolm Hayes." "Well, Malcolm Hayes, you've got yourself a friend here. Don't forget that." Malcolm smiled faintly and walked out into the early morning light. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the city. He hopped onto his bike, his muscles aching but his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The morning sun climbed higher, casting its warm light over the neighborhood, as Malcolm pedaled away from Franklin Reed's apartment. His arms ached, his legs burned, and his newspaper route was running late, but his heart felt strangely full. He hadn't done much, just pushed a wheelchair up a hill and tightened a few bolts, but something about the old man's gratitude stayed with him. As he worked his route, Malcolm's thoughts kept drifting back to Franklin. The way the man had smiled, his voice heavy with a kind of sadness Malcolm couldn't quite place. He remembered the small, empty apartment and the wheelchair that had clearly seen better days. How does someone who gave so much end up like that? Malcolm wondered. By the time he finished delivering the last paper, Malcolm was exhausted. He coasted on his bike, his mind replaying the morning's events. Suddenly he realized he'd been so preoccupied that he hadn't eaten since the night before. His stomach growled as he turned onto a quieter street lined with trees. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a slightly squished apple, and took a bite, savoring the sweetness. "Malcolm!" a voice called out from behind him. Startled, Malcolm turned to see Franklin standing on his front porch. He had swapped his tattered jacket for a cleaner, but still old sweater. His wheelchair was parked beside him. Franklin waved Malcolm over with an urgency that made the boy hesitate for a moment before pedaling back toward the apartment. "Hey, Mr. Reed," Malcolm greeted, hopping off his bike. "Everything okay?" Franklin nodded, but his face was thoughtful. I wanted to say thanks again. Not many folks stop to help these days." "It's no big deal," Malcolm replied, shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other. "Really?" Franklin chuckled softly. "That's what makes it a big deal, kid. You did it without thinking twice." There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. Then, as if compelled by some unseen force, Franklin gestured toward the small wooden bench on his porch. "You got a minute? I could use some company." Malcolm hesitated. He was already behind schedule, and he knew his mom would be waiting for him to help with chores. But something in Franklin's expression made him stay. He parked his bike against the railing and sat down on the bench, feeling the worn wood creak beneath him. Franklin leaned back in his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on a distant point in the sky. "I wasn't always in this chair, you know," he began, his voice low but steady. "Back in the day, I could run faster than most of the boys in my town. Made it all the way to the army, fought in Vietnam." Malcolm listened intently, picturing a younger version of the man beside him. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Franklin sighed, his hand resting on the arm of his wheelchair. "Got hit during an ambush. Lucky to be alive, they told me. Spent months in a hospital overseas before they shipped me home. And when I got here, well, let's just say it wasn't the homecoming I'd imagined." He paused, his eyes narrowing as if he were seeing something far away. "Lost my wife and boy in a car accident not long after. I wasn't much of a man after that. Spent a lot of years just drifting." Malcolm's chest tightened. He couldn't imagine losing his mom, let alone the rest of his family. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Franklin looked at him, his expression softening. "Don't be, kid. Life's funny like that. Takes things away, but every now and then it gives you something back." They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the neighborhood drifting around them, children laughing in the distance, a car engine sputtering to life, the chirp of birds in the trees. Malcolm felt a strange sense of peace, as if the world had paused for just a moment to let him listen. Finally, Franklin cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. "You're a good kid, Malcolm. Remind me a little of my boy. He was about your age when, well, you know?" Malcolm looked down, unsure of what to say. "I just try to do the right thing," he said after a moment. "My dad used to say that's all that matters." Franklin smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Smart man, your dad. He's right." The conversation lulled again, and Malcolm glanced at his watch. He knew he needed to get home, but he didn't want to leave. There was something comforting about being there, sitting with Franklin, sharing pieces of their lives. As if sensing Malcolm's thoughts, Franklin straightened up. "I've taken enough of your time, kid. You probably got places to be." Malcolm stood, brushing the dust from his pants. "It's okay. I'm glad we talked." Franklin reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled $20 bill again, holding it out with a smile. "Take this. Get yourself something nice." But Malcolm shook his head firmly. "No, sir. I told you, I didn't do it for money." Franklin's hand lingered in the air before he sighed and tucked the bill back into his pocket. "Well, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Malcolm nodded. "Same to you, Mr. Reed." As he rode away, Malcolm felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness for Franklin's losses, pride in being able to help, and something else he couldn't quite name. It was the kind of feeling that stayed with you, the kind that made you wonder if you'd just been part of something bigger than yourself. He didn't know it yet, but that morning's encounter would ripple through his life in ways he couldn't imagine. Franklin Reed had not only found a helper in Malcolm, but a friend, and that friendship was about to change everything. Malcolm pedaled his bike toward home as the late morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The streets of his neighborhood were already bustling. Children played with battered basketballs in the cracked asphalt streets. Vendors shouted out the day's deals, and the hum of car engines filled the air. Malcolm maneuvered carefully, his legs aching from the morning's work and his encounter with Franklin Reed still fresh in his mind. When he reached the small, dilapidated house he shared with his mother, the familiar weight of reality settled over him. The paint on the house's exterior was peeling, and the front steps creaked ominously under his feet. Malcolm parked his bike against the side of the house and stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of laundry detergent and the sound of his mother humming softly from the kitchen. "Malcolm, is that you?" Evelyn's voice called out. Her tone was bright, but carried an undercurrent of weariness. "Yeah, Mom, I'm home," Malcolm replied, setting his backpack down near the door. He walked into the kitchen, where Evelyn stood over a sink full of dishes. She turned to him, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and her eyes immediately narrowed. "Why are you so late? And where are the rest of the papers?" she asked, nodding toward his empty backpack. Malcolm hesitated, glancing down at his shoes. I stopped to help someone. An old man needed a hand with his wheelchair." Evelyn's expression softened for a moment, but it quickly shifted to concern. "Malcolm, I know you mean well, but we can't afford for you to fall behind on your deliveries. That paper route helps keep the lights on." "I know, Mom," Malcolm said, his voice quiet. "I just couldn't leave him there. He reminded me of Dad. A little." Evelyn's eyes softened again, and she reached out to place a hand on his shoulder. "You have such a good heart, baby. Your father would be proud of you." Her voice wavered slightly, and she quickly turned back to the sink, as though hiding her own emotions. Malcolm swallowed hard and nodded. He hated the look of exhaustion in his mother's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped as though she carried the weight of the world. It wasn't fair. She worked so hard, yet it always felt like they were barely scraping by. "Did you eat?" Evelyn asked, after a moment, her back still turned to him. "I had an apple," Malcolm said, sliding into one of the chairs at the small kitchen table. "That's not enough." Evelyn pulled a plate from the cupboard and placed a sandwich in front of him. "Eat! You've been out all morning." Malcolm looked at the sandwich, just peanut butter on white bread. But he knew it was made with love. "Thanks, Mom." As he ate, Malcolm's eyes wandered to the stack of bills on the table. They were held together with a rubber band, but the top envelope was crumpled and worn, its red past due stamp glaring like an accusation. He knew that pile represented sleepless nights for his mom, days spent juggling calls from creditors and worrying about the landlord's next visit. "Mom," Malcolm said hesitantly, "do you think we'll be okay this month, with the rent?" Evelyn paused, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. For a moment, Malcolm thought she might cry, but she took a deep breath and turned to him with a small, tired smile. "We always find a way, Malcolm. Don't you worry about that." But Malcolm couldn't stop worrying. That was the problem. He was only 14, but he felt like the weight of their survival rested on his shoulders. He finished his sandwich in silence, the clock ticking softly on the wall, a reminder that time was never on their side. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of orange and purple, Malcolm sat at the small desk in his room. His textbooks were spread out in front of him, but his mind wasn't on his homework. Instead, he thought about Franklin, the old man's story, his quiet strength, and the way his eyes had lit up when Malcolm fixed the wheelchair. Malcolm's room was lit by a single lamp with a flickering bulb, its light barely strong enough to illuminate the pages of his book. The walls were bare, except for a few hand-drawn sketches Malcolm had taped up, drawings of the city skyline, his mother's hands as they worked at her sewing machine, and a lone oak tree he had seen in a park once. Sketching was one of the few things that brought him peace, a way to escape the constant stress of their lives. From the kitchen, Malcolm could hear the rhythmic sound of his mother's sewing machine. She often took on extra work, repairing clothes for neighbors, anything to earn a little more money. The sound was comforting in a strange way, a reminder that she never gave up, even when the odds were against them. Maybe I could do more, Malcolm thought, his pencil pausing over the page. Maybe I could pick up another job after school. But he knew his mom wouldn't allow it. She always said his education was the most important thing, that it was his ticket to a better life. He wasn't sure he believed that anymore, not when every day felt like a battle just to keep their heads above water. As the hours ticked by, the neighborhood grew quiet. Malcolm finished his homework and stretched, his muscles sore from the morning's work. He glanced at the small window beside his bed, where the night sky was dotted with stars. A cool breeze drifted in, carrying with it the distant sound of a dog barking. He thought about Franklin again, about the way the old man had said, "Life takes things away, but every now and then it gives you something back." Malcolm didn't know what life had given Franklin, but he hoped it would be something good. The man deserved that much. That night, as Malcolm lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he felt the familiar weight of worry pressing down on him. But beneath that weight was something else, a flicker of hope, a small voice that whispered, "Maybe things can get better." Malcolm closed his eyes, letting the sound of his mother's sewing machine lull him to sleep. The morning air was crisp, with the faint scent of dew lingering as Malcolm stepped onto the porch. The sound of creaking floorboards under his feet broke the silence of the neighborhood, where most people were still inside, starting their day. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, ready to head out for school, when he noticed something unusual at the end of the street. A long, sleek black limousine rolled slowly into view, its polished exterior gleaming under the early sunlight. Malcolm froze. Cars like that didn't belong in his neighborhood. The sight of it felt out of place among the faded houses and cracked sidewalks. His eyes narrowed as the car crept closer, eventually coming to a stop right in front of his house. "Mom," Malcolm called out, his voice edged with both curiosity and caution. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her brow furrowed as she followed her son's gaze to the limousine. The driver, a tall man in a sharp suit, stepped out and moved briskly to the back door, opening it with practiced precision. A second man emerged, well-dressed, with neatly combed gray hair and a calm, composed demeanor. He adjusted his tie and looked around the neighborhood before locking eyes with Malcolm. "Are you Malcolm Hayes?" the man asked, his voice smooth but commanding. Malcolm exchanged a wary glance with his mother before nodding. "Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" The man smiled faintly and extended a hand. "Charles Reed. I'm here on behalf of my father, Franklin Reed." The name struck Malcolm like a bell. "Mr. Reed," he repeated, his voice tinged with surprise. "Is he okay?" Charles's smile softened. "He's fine, thanks to you. My father told me about the help you gave him the other day. He insisted I come here to personally thank you, and to invite you and your mother to meet with him." Evelyn stepped forward, her protective instincts immediately kicking in. "Why does he want to meet Malcolm?" she asked, her tone cautious but polite. Charles's gaze shifted to her, and he nodded respectfully. My father is a man of strong principles, ma'am. He doesn't take acts of kindness lightly, especially in a world where such gestures are increasingly rare. Malcolm's actions meant a great deal to him. He'd like the opportunity to express his gratitude in person. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes scanning Charles's face for any sign of insincerity. She didn't find any, but the situation still felt too strange. "We're not looking for handouts," she said firmly. "We get by just fine." Charles raised a hand, his voice calm and measured. "This isn't about charity. It's about appreciation. Nothing more, nothing less. My father simply wants to meet the boy who reminded him that kindness still exists." Malcolm looked at his mother, his heart pounding. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the internal struggle as she weighed the risk of stepping into the unknown against the possibility of something good coming from it. Finally, Evelyn sighed and nodded. "All right, but we're not staying long." Charles smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "Understood. If you're ready, I can take you to him now." The limousine's interior was unlike anything Malcolm had ever seen. Soft leather seats, polished wood accents, and a faint, pleasant scent that reminded him of fresh pine. He sat stiffly, his backpack still slung over his shoulder, while his mother sat beside him, her hands gripping the hem of her worn sweater. Charles rode in silence for most of the trip, giving them space to adjust. Malcolm couldn't help but stare out the window as the scenery changed. The rundown streets of their neighborhood gave way to wider roads, lined with trees and neatly trimmed lawns. The houses grew larger and more ornate with every mile. "Where are we going?" Malcolm finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. "My father's favorite diner," Charles replied, glancing at him with a small smile. "He prefers simple places. Says they remind him of the good old days." Malcolm exchanged a look with his mother, unsure what to expect. A part of him wanted to turn back, to avoid the unfamiliar, but another part, the part that remembered Franklin's tired eyes and heartfelt gratitude, wanted to see this through. The diner was quaint, with checkered floors and red leather booths that had clearly seen years of use. Franklin Reed was already seated near the back, his wheelchair positioned next to a booth. He looked up as they entered, his face breaking into a broad smile. "Malcolm!" he called out, his voice full of warmth. Malcolm couldn't help but smile back as he approached. Franklin extended a hand, and Malcolm shook it, noticing the strength in the older man's grip despite his frail appearance. "You didn't have to come," Franklin said, his gaze flicking to Evelyn. "But I'm glad you did." Evelyn nodded politely, still cautious but visibly softening under Franklin's genuine demeanor. "We wanted to meet the man my son has been talking about." Franklin chuckled. "Well, I'm nothing special. Your boy, on the other hand, is something else." They sat down, Charles joining them in the booth. A waitress came by to take their orders, and for a few minutes the conversation was light, small talk about the weather and the history of the diner. But as the food arrived, Franklin's tone grew more serious. "You know," he began, looking at Malcolm, "when you stopped to help me, I wasn't just some old man with a busted wheelchair. I was someone who'd spent years thinking the world didn't have much good left in it. Then you came along, with no reason to help, other than that it was the right thing to do." Malcolm shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure how to respond. Franklin continued, his voice steady. "You reminded me of my son, the way he used to be before life took its toll. I can't thank you enough for that." Evelyn looked at her son, her expression softening as she saw the pride in his eyes. "He's always been like that," she said quietly. "His father raised him to care about people." Franklin nodded. "He did a good job." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the table. "This is just a small token of my appreciation. It's not much, but I hope it helps." Evelyn immediately shook her head. "We can't accept that. We're not looking for charity." Franklin held up a hand, stopping her protest. "It's not charity. It's gratitude. And if it makes you feel better, think of it as a favor repaid." Malcolm glanced at the envelope, but didn't reach for it. "We'll think about it," he said carefully, not wanting to offend Franklin, but also mindful of his mother's pride. Franklin smiled, clearly satisfied with the answer. "Fair enough. But let me make one more offer." He looked at Charles, who nodded and turned to Malcolm. "How would you like to work with us, Malcolm? Part-time, after school? Nothing too demanding, but it'd give you a chance to learn some new skills and make a little extra money. Malcolm blinked, taken aback. Work with you? Doing what? Helping with my father's projects, Charles explained. He's got a few ideas for giving back to the community, and we could use someone like you, a young man with a strong work ethic and a good heart. Malcolm hesitated, glancing at his mother. Evelyn's expression was conflicted, but there was a hint of hope in her eyes. We'll talk about it, she said finally. Franklin nodded. That's all I ask. Take your time. As they left the diner, Malcolm felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, excitement, and uncertainty. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a door had opened, and all he had to do was step through. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink as Malcolm and his mother returned home. The envelope Franklin had left sat unopened on the kitchen table. Its presence seemed to fill the room, a silent reminder of the conversation they'd had. Evelyn stood by the sink, staring at it with a mix of curiosity and caution. Malcolm sat at the table, his chin resting on his hands. His mind buzzed with thoughts of Franklin's offer. A job? Working with someone like Charles Reed? It sounded almost too good to be true, but there was something about Franklin's sincerity that made it hard to doubt him. What do you think, Mom? Malcolm finally asked, breaking the silence. Evelyn sighed, turning to face him. I think it's a lot to take in. People don't usually offer help without wanting something in return. But Franklin doesn't seem like that, Malcolm countered. He's different. I mean, he's been through so much, and he still wants to help others. Evelyn sat down across from him, her hands clasped together. I know he seems genuine, Malcolm, and I can see how much you want to trust him. But I've been around long enough to know that the world isn't always kind. Malcolm looked down, his fingers tracing patterns on the table. Maybe, he said softly, but if this is a chance to make things better, shouldn't we at least try? Evelyn studied her son, seeing in his eyes a mix of hope and determination that reminded her so much of his father. She reached across the table and took his hand. We'll give it a chance, she said finally. But we'll be careful. The next day, Charles called to confirm Malcolm's decision. He explained the details of the job, a few hours after school and on weekends, helping with Franklin's community projects and learning some administrative skills at the company. Evelyn insisted on speaking with Charles herself, asking pointed questions to ensure her son's safety and the legitimacy of the offer. Satisfied with his answers, she reluctantly gave her approval. That Saturday, a familiar black limousine pulled up in front of their house. This time, Malcolm felt a little less nervous as he climbed in. Charles greeted him warmly, asking about school and his interests as they drove through the city. Malcolm answered cautiously at first, but Charles's easygoing manner quickly put him at ease. The car pulled up to an impressive office building in the heart of downtown Atlanta. Its glass facade shimmered in the afternoon sunlight, and Malcolm couldn't help but feel a little out of place in his well-worn sneakers and second-hand jacket. Charles seemed to sense his discomfort and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You belong here, Malcolm, he said with a smile. Don't let the building intimidate you. It's just walls and windows. The real work happens inside. Inside, the atmosphere was a blend of professionalism and warmth. Employees greeted Charles with respect and curiosity as he led Malcolm to a private conference room. Franklin was already there, seated at the head of the table. His wheelchair was polished, and his posture was straighter than Malcolm had seen before. He smiled as Malcolm entered. There he is, Franklin said, his voice filled with warmth. Our newest team member. Malcolm blushed and mumbled a quiet, Hi, Mr. Reed. Franklin motioned for him to sit. No need to be shy, son. You've earned your place here. Charles handed Malcolm a folder filled with papers detailing his responsibilities. The job was simple, but meaningful, helping to organize donations, attending community outreach events, and assisting Franklin with correspondence. Malcolm's eyes widened as he skimmed through the pages. You'll learn a lot here, Charles explained, but more importantly, you'll see the impact of what we do. My father believes in giving back, and you're going to help us make that happen. The first day was a whirlwind. Malcolm shadowed Charles and Franklin, attending meetings and learning the ins and outs of their operations. By the time he got home that evening, he was exhausted but exhilarated. He told his mother everything. from the welcoming employees to the plans Franklin had for helping struggling families. Evelyn listened quietly, her expression softening as Malcolm spoke. She could see the spark in his eyes, the excitement that had been missing for so long. "I'm proud of you," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You're doing something good, Malcolm, something important." Over the next few weeks, Malcolm settled into his new routine. He juggled school, work, and his paper route, each day feeling more confident in his abilities. Franklin quickly became a mentor to him, sharing stories from his past and lessons he'd learned about resilience and perseverance. "You know, Malcolm," Franklin said one evening as they reviewed plans for an upcoming event, "life's not just about surviving. It's about finding ways to thrive, even when the odds are against you." Malcolm nodded, letting the words sink in. "My dad used to say something like that," he replied. He said, "You can't control the hand you're dealt, but you can control how you play it." Franklin smiled, his eyes glistening with pride. "Smart man, your dad." As the weeks turned into months, Malcolm began to see the world differently. He no longer felt trapped by his circumstances. Instead, he felt empowered to change them, not just for himself and his mother, but for others who were struggling, just like Franklin. The soft hum of the office filled the air as Malcolm sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and spreadsheets. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of activity, but Malcolm had quickly adjusted to his new responsibilities. His mornings were spent at school, afternoons at Franklin Reed's office, and evenings helping his mom at home. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in his life, Malcolm felt like he was building something meaningful. Today, he was tasked with organizing donations for an upcoming Veterans Assistance Drive. The company had partnered with a local nonprofit to provide wheelchairs, medical supplies, and care packages for veterans in need. As Malcolm sifted through the inventory list, he felt a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing great, kid," Franklin said, his voice warm. He rolled his wheelchair closer, glancing at the neatly organized folders on the desk. "Better than I could have done at your age." Malcolm grinned, a flicker of pride lighting up his face. "Thanks, Mr. Reed. It's kind of fun, actually." Franklin chuckled. "Careful, that attitude might get you promoted." The two shared a laugh before Franklin's expression grew more thoughtful. "You know, Malcolm, when I was your age, I didn't have opportunities like this. I was too busy trying to figure out where my next meal was coming from. You remind me of myself, except smarter." Malcolm looked at him, surprised by the compliment. "You've done a lot more than I have, Mr. Reed. I'm just trying to keep up." Franklin shook his head. "Don't sell yourself short, kid. The work you're doing here, it matters. Never forget that." Later that afternoon, as Malcolm was finishing up his tasks, he heard a knock on the doorframe. He turned to see a girl about his age standing there, her blonde hair tied back in a ponytail and a curious smile on her face. She wore a simple outfit, jeans and a hoodie with the company's logo on it. "Hey, you're the new guy, right?" she asked, stepping into the room. Malcolm nodded, standing awkwardly. Yeah, Malcolm. And you are?" "Sophie," she said, extending a hand. "My dad works here. He said you're helping out with the Veterans Project." "Yeah," Malcolm replied, shaking her hand. "It's been, interesting." Sophie laughed. "Don't worry, it gets easier. My dad says you're doing a good job, though." Malcolm felt his face flush. "Thanks, I'm just trying to keep things organized." "Well," Sophie said, leaning against the desk, "if you ever need help, let me know. I've been volunteering here since I was 10. I know where all the snacks are hidden." Malcolm chuckled, his nerves easing. "I'll keep that in mind." Sophie stayed for a while, chatting about the upcoming event and sharing stories about her experiences with the company. Her energy was infectious, and Malcolm found himself smiling more than he had in days. By the time she left, he realized he had just made his first friend at the office. That evening, Malcolm returned home, his backpack heavier than usual. Inside was a folder of materials Franklin had given him to review, documents about the Veterans Drive and tips on public speaking. Franklin had asked Malcolm to give a short speech at the event, explaining the importance of their work. The thought made Malcolm's stomach churn with nerves. As he stepped through the front door, Evelyn looked up from the kitchen table, where she was sorting through a pile of fabric. "How was work today?" she asked. Malcolm set his backpack down and sank into a chair. "Good. Busy, but good." Evelyn smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You're doing great, baby." I can see it in the way you carry yourself. This job, it's changing you." Malcolm hesitated, then pulled out the folder and placed it on the table. "Mr. Reed asked me to speak at the event next week." Evelyn's eyebrows shot up. "A speech? That's a big deal, Malcolm." "I don't know if I can do it," Malcolm admitted, his voice quiet. "What if I mess up?" Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand. "You'll do fine. Just speak from the heart. People will listen." The week flew by as Malcolm prepared for the event. Sophie helped him draft his speech, offering tips on how to connect with the audience. Franklin coached him on staying calm and confident, sharing his own stories of speaking to crowds. By the time the big day arrived, Malcolm still felt nervous, but he also felt ready. The event was held in a large community center, decorated with banners and tables overflowing with donations. Veterans and their families filled the room, their faces a mix of gratitude and hope. Malcolm stood backstage, clutching his note cards, as Franklin rolled up beside him. "You've got this," Franklin said, his voice steady. "Just be yourself." Malcolm nodded, taking a deep breath. When his name was called, he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight warm on his face. He looked out at the crowd, his heart pounding, and began to speak. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Malcolm Hayes, and I'm honored to be here today. When I first started working with Mr. Reed and this amazing team, I didn't know much about veterans or their struggles. But over the past few weeks, I've learned how much they've sacrificed for all of us, and how important it is for us to give back. I'm just a kid from Atlanta. My family doesn't have much, but we've always believed in doing the right thing, no matter how small. A few weeks ago, I met Mr. Reed. He needed help with his wheelchair, and I thought it was just another moment in my day. But that small moment turned into something so much bigger. Today, I see how one act of kindness can grow into something that changes lives. And I want to thank all of you for being part of that change." As Malcolm finished, the room erupted into applause. Franklin gave him a thumbs up from the side of the stage, and Sophie beamed at him from the crowd. Malcolm felt a rush of pride and relief as he stepped down, shaking hands with people who came up to thank him. That night, as he lay in bed, Malcolm thought about how far he'd come. He still didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. And he couldn't wait to see where it would lead. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Franklin Reed's office, casting long shadows across the neatly arranged desks. Malcolm had become a familiar face in the office, his once hesitant demeanor now replaced with quiet confidence. He moved efficiently, sorting through emails and double-checking the logistics for their next community outreach event. But today felt different. There was tension in the air, an unspoken worry that lingered among the staff. Malcolm noticed the furrow in Franklin's brow as he read over a report, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of his wheelchair. "Mr. Reed, is everything okay?" Malcolm asked cautiously, placing a stack of files on the desk. Franklin looked up, his expression softening when he saw Malcolm. "It's nothing for you to worry about, kid. Just a few challenges we're facing with some of our partners." Malcolm frowned. "What kind of challenges?" Franklin hesitated, then sighed. "One of the companies we've been working with, the ones helping supply materials for the Veterans Project, might be pulling out. They're under pressure from competitors, and it's affecting their ability to support us." The news hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. He had seen firsthand how much these projects meant to the veterans and their families. Losing a major partner could derail everything they had worked so hard to build. "Is there anything we can do?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady despite the anxiety building in his chest. Franklin studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "We're already working on backup plans, but a strong community presence would help. If we can show people how much these projects matter, it might convince others to step up." Over the next few days, Malcolm threw himself into the task. He worked late into the evenings, coordinating with Sophie and the rest of the team to organize a rally at the community center. They planned to bring together veterans, their families, and local supporters to highlight the impact of their work. As the event approached, the pressure mounted. Malcolm juggled school, work, and the rally preparations, often staying up late into the night. His mom noticed the strain and tried to convince him to take a break, but Malcolm refused. "This is important, Mom," he insisted. "People are counting on us." Evelyn sighed, her worry evident, but she didn't push further. She saw the determination in her son's eyes and knew he wouldn't stop until the job was done. The day of the rally arrived with clear skies and a buzz of anticipation. The community center was packed, the energy in the room palpable. Veterans shared their stories, and families expressed their gratitude for the support they had received. Malcolm, standing backstage with a clipboard, felt a mix of pride and nervousness. "You ready?" Sophie asked, nudging him with a playful smile. "Ready as I'll ever be," Malcolm replied, adjusting the microphone clip to his shirt. When his turn came, Malcolm stepped onto the stage, the applause from the crowd washing over him like a wave. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say. "Thank you all for being here today," Malcolm began, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves. "I want to share a story about a moment that changed my life. It was just a few weeks ago on an ordinary morning when I met a man who taught me the true meaning of kindness and resilience. That man is Franklin Reed. He showed me that even in the face of loss and hardship, we can find the strength to keep going and to help others along the way. That's what this project is about. It's about more than just donations or events. It's about building a community where everyone feels seen, valued, and supported." The audience erupted into applause as Malcolm finished. He glanced at Franklin, who was seated in the front row, a look of quiet pride on his face. Malcolm's chest swelled with a sense of accomplishment. The rally was a resounding success. New sponsors stepped forward, and the company secured enough resources to keep their projects going. Malcolm felt a deep sense of relief and satisfaction, knowing that their efforts had made a real difference. But the day wasn't without its challenges. Later that evening, as the team packed up the venue, Franklin suddenly slumped in his wheelchair, his face pale. "Mr. Reed!" Malcolm exclaimed, rushing to his side. Franklin waved a hand weakly, trying to dismiss the concern. "I'm fine, just overdid it today." Charles appeared moments later, his face etched with worry. "Dad, you need to rest. We're taking you to the hospital." Malcolm watched helplessly as Charles and another team member helped Franklin into a car. His mind raced with fear and guilt. Had the rally been too much for him? Was this his fault? That night, Malcolm sat in his room, staring at his phone. He thought about calling Charles for an update but didn't want to intrude. Instead, he poured his energy into planning the next steps for the Veterans Projects, determined to honor Franklin's efforts no matter what. The following day, Malcolm received a text from Charles. "Dad's stable. He'll be okay, but the doctors say he needs to take it easy for a while. Thanks for everything yesterday. He's proud of you." Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with a renewed sense of responsibility. Franklin had given so much, and now it was Malcolm's turn to step up. As the chapter closed, Malcolm stood at a crossroads. The rally had been a victory, but it also highlighted the fragility of the man who had become his mentor. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face whatever challenges came their way. For the first time, Malcolm truly understood what Franklin meant when he said, "Life's not just about surviving. It's about finding ways to thrive, even when the odds are against you." The days following Franklin's hospitalization passed in a blur. Malcolm threw himself into his responsibilities, balancing school, work, and the growing demands of the Veterans Outreach programs. Despite the weight of it all, he felt a deep sense of purpose. Franklin's words, "Kindness is a ripple, it spreads farther than you can see," echoed in his mind, driving him forward. One crisp morning, Malcolm arrived at the office to find Charles waiting for him in the lobby. Dressed sharply in his usual tailored suit, Charles greeted Malcolm with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How's Mr. Reed?" Malcolm asked, setting his backpack down. Charles's smile faltered for a moment. "He's doing better, but the doctors say he needs to stay home and rest for a while. He's not happy about it, of course, but we're keeping a close eye on him." Malcolm nodded, relief washing over him. "That's good. I'm glad he's okay." Charles motioned for Malcolm to follow him. "Actually, there's something he's been wanting to share with you. He asked me to bring you to him today." The car ride to Franklin's home was quiet, the city's bustling streets gradually giving way to a quieter neighborhood lined with towering oak trees. Malcolm stared out the window, his mind racing with questions. What could Franklin possibly want to tell him? Was it about the projects, or something more personal? When they arrived, Charles led Malcolm into the house. Franklin was waiting in the sunlit living room, seated in his wheelchair with a warm smile on his face. A table beside him held a stack of papers and a framed photograph of a younger Franklin with his wife and son. "Malcolm," Franklin said, his voice steadier than Malcolm expected. "Come on in, kid. We've got some things to talk about." Malcolm sat down on the couch across from Franklin, glancing nervously at the papers on the table. "Is everything okay, Mr. Reed?" Franklin nodded, his expression softening. "Better than okay. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few weeks. About life, about legacy, and about you." "Me?" Malcolm asked, his brows furrowing. Franklin leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "You've shown me something I thought I'd lost, a belief in the goodness of people. That's not something you come across every day, and it's made me realize I've still got more to give." He gestured to the stack of papers. "I've started something. Something I hope will make a lasting difference, and I want you to be a part of it." Malcolm leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Franklin smiled. "The Franklin Reed Foundation. It's a nonprofit I've set up to help veterans and struggling families get back on their feet. It's something I've been dreaming of for years, but I never thought I'd have the strength to see it through. Meeting you changed that." Malcolm's mouth fell open. "A foundation? You mean this is real?" "Real as it gets," Franklin replied with a chuckle. "We've already secured funding, thanks to some old friends of mine and Charles's connections. But here's the thing, Malcolm. I don't just want you to work with the foundation. I want you to help lead it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Malcolm stared at Franklin, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Lead it? Mr. Reed, I'm just a kid. I don't know how to run a foundation." Franklin's eyes sparkled with determination. "You've got more heart and grit than most people twice your age, and you won't be doing it alone. Charles will guide you, and the team we've put together is solid. But this foundation needs someone who understands what it's like to struggle, someone who can connect with the people we're trying to help. That someone is you." Malcolm's mind spun. The weight of the offer was overwhelming. But beneath the fear was a flicker of pride. Franklin believed in him, in his potential to make a difference. He thought of his mom, of their tiny house, and the stack of bills that never seemed to shrink. He thought of the veterans he'd met, their stories of sacrifice and resilience. This was bigger than him, bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. "I don't know what to say," Malcolm admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Say yes," Franklin said simply. "You've got what it takes, kid. I know you do." That evening, Malcolm returned home with the news. He found Evelyn in the kitchen, sewing a patch onto one of his shirts. She looked up as he entered, her brow furrowing at the expression on his face. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked. Malcolm set his backpack down and sat across from her. "Nothing's wrong, Mom. It's just, I need to tell you something." He explained everything: the foundation, Franklin's vision, and the role he'd been offered. Evelyn listened silently, her hands stilling as she absorbed the magnitude of what her son was saying. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes glistening. "Malcolm, do you realize what this means? This is incredible." "I know," Malcolm said, his voice trembling. "But it's a lot, Mom. What if I mess it up?" Evelyn reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "You won't. You've already proven you can do amazing things. Franklin sees that, and so do I." Malcolm looked at her, the doubt in his heart slowly giving way to a sense of determination. "I want to do this, Mom, not just for me, but for you, for everything you've sacrificed for me, and for people like Franklin who deserve a second chance." Evelyn smiled, tears spilling over as she pulled him into a hug. "You make me so proud, Malcolm. So proud." The next morning, Malcolm called Franklin to accept the offer. Over the following weeks, he dove headfirst into his new role, balancing his responsibilities at the foundation with his schoolwork. It wasn't easy, but with Franklin's mentorship and Charles's guidance, Malcolm began to find his footing. The foundation's first major project was a housing initiative for homeless veterans, providing them with safe, affordable places to live. Malcolm worked tirelessly alongside the team, meeting with veterans, coordinating resources, and even giving interviews to local media. The chapter ended with the launch of the initiative, a ceremony attended by veterans, families, and community leaders. As Malcolm stood on stage, cutting the ribbon to open the first housing complex, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. In the crowd, he spotted Franklin, seated next to Evelyn and Sophie. Franklin gave him a proud nod, and Evelyn wiped away tears as she watched her son step into his new role. For Malcolm, this wasn't just a new chapter in his life. It was the beginning of a legacy. A legacy built on kindness, resilience, and the unwavering belief that even the smallest acts of compassion could create ripples that changed the world. 15 years had passed since Malcolm Hayes first met Franklin Reed on that quiet street in Atlanta. Now, 30 years old, Malcolm stood at the podium of a grand auditorium, his heart pounding as he surveyed the room. The Franklin Reed Foundation's annual gala was in full swing, with hundreds of attendees gathered to celebrate the organization's achievements. The air buzzed with energy, the clinking of glasses and soft murmurs filling the space as the crowd waited for Malcolm to speak. The foundation had grown beyond anything Malcolm could have imagined. What began as a small nonprofit aimed at helping veterans now encompassed housing initiatives, education programs, and healthcare support for underserved communities across the country. The work had been challenging, but it had also been the most fulfilling part of Malcolm's life. Standing to the side of the stage was Sophie Reed, now his wife and the foundation's executive director. Her warm smile and reassuring nod gave Malcolm the confidence he needed to begin. "Good evening, everyone," Malcolm started, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling in his chest. 15 years ago, I was just a kid delivering newspapers, trying to make ends meet. I never imagined that a chance encounter with a kind-hearted man would change the course of my life and the lives of so many others. The audience fell silent, hanging on to his every word. Franklin Reed taught me that kindness is a seed. You may never know where it will grow, but it will always bear fruit. That lesson has guided me every step of the way, and it's why we're here tonight. Malcolm paused, his eyes scanning the room. He saw veterans who had found new beginnings through the Foundation's housing programs, families whose children had received scholarships, and volunteers who had given their time and energy to help others. It was a living testament to the power of compassion. Tonight, we celebrate not just what we've accomplished, but what's still to come. Franklin believed in leaving the world better than he found it, and together, we can continue that mission. The room erupted into applause as Malcolm stepped back from the podium. He caught Sophie's eye, her pride evident as she clapped along with the crowd. The gala continued late into the evening, with speeches, performances, and heartfelt testimonials from those whose lives had been touched by the Foundation. But for Malcolm, the most poignant moment came during the closing ceremony. A large screen descended from the ceiling, displaying a video montage of Franklin's life and legacy. The footage included clips of him sharing stories with veterans, attending ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and mentoring Malcolm in those early days. It ended with Franklin's signature phrase, "Kindness doesn't end with one person, it's a legacy." Malcolm felt a lump form in his throat as the audience gave a standing ovation. Franklin had passed away 3 years earlier, but his spirit remained a guiding force for everyone involved with the Foundation. After the event, Malcolm and Sophie stepped outside into the cool night air. The city skyline glittered above them, a reminder of how far they'd come. Malcolm reached for Sophie's hand, their fingers intertwining. "I think he'd be proud," Sophie said softly, her gaze fixed on the stars. Malcolm nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope so. None of this would have happened without him." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder. "And none of this would have happened without you. You took his lesson and turned it into something extraordinary." Malcolm smiled, a quiet contentment settling over him. "We did it together." The next morning, Malcolm and Sophie visited a small park on the edge of the city. It was the same park where Malcolm used to deliver newspapers as a teenager. Now, it was home to the Franklin Reed Community Center, a bustling hub that offered free classes, job training, and support services to local families. They strolled through the center's main hall, greeting staff and volunteers. At the end of the tour, they stopped by a quiet memorial garden where a simple plaque bore Franklin's name alongside the Foundation's motto, "Kindness doesn't end with one person. It's a legacy." Their son, a bright-eyed 5-year-old named Franklin in honor of the man who had changed their lives, ran ahead to examine the flowers. Malcolm watched him with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "Do you think he'll understand one day?" Sophie asked, watching their son. Malcolm nodded. "He'll know, and we'll make sure he carries it forward." As they walked back to the car, hand in hand with little Franklin between them, Malcolm felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The road had been long and often difficult, but every step had been worth it. Together they had built something that would endure, a legacy of kindness, love, and hope that would continue to grow for generations to come. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.